BlackJupiter to back welcome, random agent I'm going its house. That sentence was backwards and I'm not keeping that up for the whole video because that sounds like pain. Guys, look, it's Random's gonna talk about The World Ends With You o'clock. The current year is 2022, and it's been over a year since Square decided to remind us that they still remember The World Ends With You by giving it an anime adaptation and a second game. That said, unless you just love Theatrhythm, there isn't much going on with The World Ends With You these days. I recorded most of this video before the Steam announcement, so shut up, I'll talk about it later. If you wanted to, you could take this as a sign of the franchise dying forever or whatever. But I mean, come on. This community's gone through far more dire situations before. So pull up a chair, kids, and sit by the fireplace. Today, I'm going to tell you the story of the great World Ends With You drought of 2008 through 2020. Back in 2007, a couple Kingdom Hearts developers took some time out of their day to make a DS game called The World Ends With You. It was a smash hit amongst pretty much anyone that played it, which does not mean that people actually did in the first place. Yeah, the game underperformed hard, which surely would never be a sign of what's to come. This left the game with the status of being one of the DS's hidden gems. And while its story was very conclusive and gave us a perfectly happy ending for at least 4 out of 5 characters on the box, the post-game content hinted at a lot of things to come in the future. It talked about a whole society of higher beings and extremely powerful enemy types that we barely, if ever, got to see in the main story. This is all to say that while The World Ends With You wasn't a game that needed more installments, it definitely had room for them to exist, and many fans sure as heck wanted to see more from the series that was way too unique to end with its beginning. But the game's developers were very aware that it would take a miracle to get another game. In interviews, they didn't outright deny the chance of a second one, but they weren't exactly optimistic about it, saying that they'd see what would happen once they met their sales goal. But there was one member of the team who wasn't just going to lie down and let this game die. Just like the fans, he adored The World Ends With You, and it was going to thrive even if it killed him. This man was the game's creative producer, Tetsuya Nomura. For those who have been spared knowing who this man is, Nomura is like the big shot of Square Enix. He runs all of the Kingdom Hearts operations and frequently heads Final Fantasy projects. And he has a really weird relationship with The World Ends With You. He's not the writer, but just about anything he wants added to the story does wind up getting added. He's not the director, but a staggering amount of the game's ideas can be sourced back to him. So basically, he's not the game's dad like many people might lead you to believe, but he's more like the game's uncle that it stays with once every other week and gets life advice from. That sure is an analogy. What I'm trying to say is that basically he's the only reason that the game exists today the way that it does. Nomura spent the next several years using any opportunity available to constantly push Square to let a new World Ends With You exist. All the while, fans were in the dark about these going-ons. After 5 years, it began to feel a little hopeless. But then, something extraordinary happened. One of the single most infamous events in the history of the World Ends With You community. That August, the World Ends With You official website updated, replacing the background image with a dark visual of the 104 building, adding some strange background instrumentals, and most tantalizing of all, a mysterious countdown ticking down from 7 days. The community went into a frenzy. It was finally happening! The next chapter! Would it be released on a 3DS? Or, God forbid, the Wii U? What would it play like? Would Neku still be in it? How much Tinpin should we expect? All the questions that one would reasonably ask when teased with the idea of more World Ends With You. As each day ticked by, the background lit up more and more while more instrumentals and eventually vocals were added to the music. This created a song that we had never heard before, a track that would go on to be named Twister Crossover. As the countdown neared its end, there were some murmurings that there was like a World Ends With You port listed on the iTunes store, but surely that was nothing, right? It's, not a second game. It's the same game. Thanks for hyping up a mobile port, Square. Real swell of you. Needless to say, people were not happy. On one hand, they were never told that this was a second game. That was technically just a conclusion that the community jumped to, but come on. No one would have expected Square to create this much hype for an inferior port of a 5-year-old game. And I won't lie, it is kinda funny in an ironic way that fans were getting mad at the time for too much marketing. Like I said, Solo Remix is generally agreed upon to be the worst version of the game, but it did have one very interesting new inclusion. A new girl that really got people talking. No, not her, I'm all cocoed out. This lady! Upon getting all the secret reports, players are greeted with this splash screen. Some mysterious girl with headphones and Mr. Mew joined with the text, "New 7 days." In the present, we know her as Segumi Matsune, but at the time, she had no name. So the community took the liberty of dubbing her as Hype-chan. I tried to see if I could track the origin of that name, but came up short. If anyone happens to know where it first stemmed from, I'd be really interested to know. Leave a comment. This teaser was left here because Nomura wanted people to know that he was planning on giving us the next installment and wouldn't be taking no for an answer. His main hurdle to overcome was the series' extreme obscurity. The second game would not begin development until they at least tried to remedy that. So Nomura and the team came up with a 3-step plan to solve their issue. Step 1, port the original game to a device that was actually being currently used. I really would have thought that the 3DS would have been the easy go-to, especially since, according to leaks and interviews, that was where the second game would have originally gone, and then you wouldn't have had to water down the gameplay to fit on one screen, but you know, whatever, Square, you do you. Step 2, gets people to actually know that the port exists by playing Nomura's trump card. Nomura enacted the single largest piece of advertising to ever exist for the World Ends With You series, and its name was Kingdom Hearts Dream Drop Distance. Nomura gave the main cast of The World Ends With You fairly meaty cameos early on into the game's narrative, thus making hundreds of thousands of players at least sort of aware about The World Ends With You. I've already made a whole video talking about the crossover, so I won't go into too much detail here, but it definitely helped The World Ends With You get some recognition. Still not anything huge, but it created the largest spike in the series' popularity at the time. And for the final step of the plan, Square expanded the World Ends With You brand with a mobile social game that was sure to— dang, I couldn't even finish that sentence before I got offline. This is another case of, I already went in depth here before, but the game, called Live Remix, had the two major setbacks of existing too early for technology to be able to handle it and only releasing in Japan. And while that on its own may not have been enough to sink the World Ends With You 2 ship, Square's financial issues in 2014 definitely were. This is also the point where development on Kingdom Hearts 3 really began and started to eat up Nomura's time. With these factors combined, it just wasn't the right time to move forward with the second game anymore, and it wouldn't be the right time again until Kingdom Hearts 3 was nearly finished. Something else to keep in mind is that a majority of fans were totally in the dark about this. From their point of view, Square had ignored the series for 5 years, overhyped a dang port, gave us a small cameo in another game, and then a spin-off that most people couldn't even play. Following that, nothing. 4 more years of emptiness and silence. Unless you just love Theatrhythm. But by 2018, it was Kingdom Hearts 3's release year. Until the English version needed some more time to cook, and the whole thing was delayed to 2019, but it was supposed to be Kingdom Hearts 3's release year. Finally, Nomura could take some time to begin working on another project. Top of his list, a Kingdom Hearts rhythm game for some freaking reason, and then a new World Ends With You. However, while Nomura was trapped in the Kingdom Hearts development dungeon, he ran into the issue of nobody knowing who Rhyme was again, so he needed to create a new Make the World Ends With You relevant for a little while plan. Just like before, the first step was to port the game to a more relevant platform, in this case, the Nintendo Switch. The game was announced at the start of a Nintendo Direct in January 2018. At the time, I wasn't a fan of the game, but kept my eye on it because, oh hey, that's the pretty boy who taught Riku how to bake a bat in the back alley of Traverse Town. Wait, didn't he have angel wings? But meanwhile, fans of the game were happy to see that the world interview was somehow still alive. Shout out to the one person tweeting that the game was forever dead literally the day before the final remix announcement. Fans were ecstatic to return to Shibuya again, and hey, wait, it's her! I'll get to that. But first, if I had to guess, the Square Enix higher-ups told Nomura and the World Interview team that they needed this game out by October or they would pull the plug on the second game. As a result, Final Remix was kinda rushed out. That is just conjecture, but I'd say it's a safe bet because the game's internals are really messy. Like, really messy. The title screen art has an unused, higher resolution version that goes unused because of a typo in the code. There's a subtitle feature for the cutscenes that's completed but not actually accessible. There were plans to reincorporate the way partners function in the original game, but that was scrapped for just copy and pasting the mobile version of the combat system instead. But don't worry guys, the devs had enough time to write like 75 new thought fragments just for a new day. Priorities. Which, by the way, a new day! A New Day was a new chapter added to the game's post-game, and it was as much of a smash hit as The World Ends With You is popular. That is to say, not at all. A New Day is where the teaser image from Solo Remix started to bite the team in the butt, because this image was set up for a game that no longer exists. The game that the sequel was now shaping up to be was taking a very different direction than what was envisioned 6 years prior. 6 years ago, they likely wanted Hype-chan to be the protagonist, but they didn't anymore. But she still needs a role, and one that's important enough to warrant her being the literal face of what's yet to come. In short, the team had no plan for this woman, but still needed to pay off her setup. So, A New Day featured Miss Hype doing some more teasery shenanigans as she was integrated into the plot in the most remote way possible. The new content wasn't super well written, if you can't tell. Probably another symptom of the game's rushed development. And not to mention that the direction that the second game was going in changed again after A New Day was written, which was really unfortunate for the team because now they had to pay off all the setup from Solo and Final Remix in a plot that would be much better off if it could just do its own thing. Like, I can't stress this enough. By the end of A New Day, it was set up that Hype-chan exists, has Mr. Mew, and can send Neku visions of the future, that Neku was sent back to the Yuji, Hanakoma was going to investigate exactly what was going on, and that this little demon child had world-ending cosmic powers that she probably got from her boss who was tied to the higher plane. Oh, also she did some human transmutation and brought Minamimoto back to life to be Neku's new partner. And if you've played the second game, you'll know that all of those elements are either crammed into the plot while not really fitting in with the rest of the story, or just went ignored entirely. I'm still so salty that they totally dropped what they were doing with Coco. I wanted the second game to let me punch that child square, come on! The only things from A New Day that seem to properly set up the second game is the destruction of Shinjuku and how one piece of flavor text mentions time travel. Otherwise, it feels like A New Day is trying to set up a totally different game than the one we actually got. Which is also a different game than the one they tried to set up 6 years prior. The dangling threads for which all still need to be addressed when the second game eventually comes. And I say when in that sentence because of hindsight. To most fans at the time, it was more of a question of if. We were also butthurt after the countdown in the Solo Remix teaser meaning nothing that nobody wanted to entertain the idea that A New Day was actually going anywhere. Especially since Final Remix kept the series staple of bombing hard with sales. The idea that The World Ends With You could become a full series was kinda silly at the time. People saw this game as a one and done. Anytime The World Ends With You was brought back up by Square, it was to tell that same original story. And that was a very good story with a fantastic ending. But remember how I said that Neku gets sent back to the Yuji in A New Day? Well, it almost felt insulting to see Square make a new chapter that revoked our original ending and set up a new game that, frankly speaking, wasn't likely to ever exist. Neku dying again didn't feel like that's just what was going on right now in the story. The World Ends With You had never had an ongoing plot before, so it just felt like that was our new ending and it really sucked. The tragedy here is that the devs knew for a fact that a second game was coming since it had now started development, but they couldn't properly communicate that to us. The interviews after Final Remix's release did their best to keep the fans optimistic, much to the contrast of the interviews following the original game's release, but it was too late. From the fans' point of view, Final Remix was the final destination, especially since the devs clarified that this was the last time they would remake this game. It's like the light at the end of the tunnel was visible for the fan base, but they had spent so long in the darkness that they couldn't actually see it. Also, I first played the game around this time. It was, a really grim time to become a World Ends With You fan. You needed to give a trigger warning when saying the word countdown, and the phrase "a new day" was seen as vulgarity. Maybe hyperbolizing a bit, but you get the idea. We were desperate and depressed when it came to this game. Like, the official websites went down one day and left this maintenance message behind, and all of our heart rates shot up. Could it be? Have our dreams finally been realized? Has the fated day arrived? No. Turns out Square left the website on the kitchen counter so long that it spoiled. This message wasn't here because there was construction going on. It was because Square forgot the website existed and it needed to be updated. I think the only two pieces of World Ends With You news that happened in 2019 were data miners finding a poster that looked like Neku in Kingdom Hearts 3's Out of Bounds, and a reliable leaker leaking that a new World Ends With You was in development. But like I said, we were all so hopeless that practically nobody actually believed the leak. But oh well. Back over at Square, they were prepping for step 2 of the Make the World Ends With You relevant for a little while plan. The second step was to make an anime adaptation of the original game. Animes are able to do wonders for marketing since they tend to come with mountains of merchandise. The animation was set to be announced in 2020 at Anime Expo. This was such a big deal apparently that original World Ends With You art was created to be the cover for the program that year. But unfortunately, the world ended with 2020 and Anime Expo was no longer a physical event, but it was still to be held online as a live stream. As a result, the program art was released a little early and dropped like a freaking bombshell. Anime Expo was just so casual about it. Oh hey, here's some art from our convention this year, isn't it cool? Meanwhile, we're all over here being like, wait a second, that's pin 0, pin 23, and pin 81. That all adds up to 104, what could it mean? It was a very busy day, alright? Also, shout out to everyone who thought that these two boneheads were new characters when they're actually just the Anime Expo mascots. It's me, I'm everyone. But keep in mind, we only had this image to go off of. We weren't told that this was for a World Ends With You anime. They just dropped this image with no context. Dare we think that it actually means the World Ends With You 2? An anime convention would be a little bit of a weird place to drop an announcement for that. I mean, it couldn't be a port. The devs said that there would be no more ports. Well, as the days went by, a new Twitter account got created called @TWEWYPR. And its icon was a little logo that read, "The World Ends With You, the animation." It wasn't a new game. It was an anime. I remember that I had really mixed feelings about this at the time. I thought this was for sure going to be a new game. And in a way, this was our 4th version of the original story. The World Ends With You anime remix, if you will. I guess I was just led astray by them using what was for sure going to be just the game's art style on promo art for the anime. Like, I thought if this art was going to be for an anime, it would be in a more animation-friendly art style, you know? But whatever, it's not like Square was going out of their way to troll us like with that countdown. I take it back. I have this website bookmarked as pain. Square Enix woke up with a vengeance one morning and said, "Hey everybody, remember when we totally baited you all 8 years ago with a countdown? We'll have another!" At least it was clear what the countdown was for this time, but come on, Square knew exactly what they were doing and I don't think anyone was amused. Anyways, the promotion for the animation began, and it began loud. Hey, remember when everyone thought this was gonna be true to the game? Yeah, that was funny. After a couple trailers, it began to become clear that this was more of a new interpretation of the game's events rather than a one-for-one retelling. Also, they seemed to be dropping a new day, judging by the lack of my worst nightmare on the website's character list, which I guess made sense. It's not like this show was just meant to be a 4.5-hour advertisement for a second game or anything. No point in ending it on a cliffhanger that forces people to buy a new game to see what happens next if the new game doesn't exist. They'd only do that if a new game was actually coming. And then we all woke up one morning to this monstrosity. I thought we left you behind in 2012. I have this website bookmarked as more pain. I think Square Enix was legitimately just screwing with us at this point. Out of the blue, they opened a new website with a new countdown exactly identical to the solo remix one. I don't think anyone knew what they were supposed to feel here. It was an unhealthy smoothie of hype, dread, PTSD, some more hype, and utter confusion. Some people tried to pick apart the background image and music to theorize on what they could be building towards. I guess they just didn't realize that these were the same exact assets from 8 years ago. Some people thought it had something to do with the anime, but no, they haven't typed up any of the previous trailers or info for the anime like this before, so why start now? Some thought it would be another port on like Steam or something, but most people were still too scarred to entertain the idea that it was for sure some new entry and just chose to abstain from too much hope, which was probably the safest way to go about it. I, for one, was full of optimism and was pretty confident that it had to be a new game since it was being promoted by the Square Enix Twitter account for game development. Well, this could have gone any which way. I guess we just had to wait for us to repeat through all of the same motions from the first time. Or did we? Because every time the day changed on the countdown, a video would briefly play, which didn't happen for the solo remix countdown. What were these videos? Trailers. Old trailers. Trailers for the DS game, solo remix, final remix, and even the anime. And then on the final day, we saw this. A hand holding a phone with this odd symbol. Was it the Scramble Crossing? No, that doesn't fit. And whose hand was this? If this is what was waiting for us at the end of the countdown, I don't even think I'd be mad. I'd just be ashamed that Square had this much control over my emotional well-being. As the final hours ticked by, Square decided to drop a new trailer for the freaking anime just 3 hours before the countdown ended. I swear we all collectively had a heart attack in that moment where we all briefly thought that the countdown was for this, before we realized that the countdown was still ticking. That moment of dread turned into confirmation for a few. This couldn't be for the anime. They just dropped anime news. This had to be for something else, and there's no way it could be for another port. Just impossible. Final Remix was the final time. And then the countdown reached 0. And the website crashed for me and I had to reload the page only to be greeted to the NEO official website. But for most people, they were greeted with one last troll from Square Enix. A video appeared and the first thing seen was the start of a final remix trailer. They really had to get in one last laugh there. This singular moment is what makes me absolutely certain that Square knew exactly how this weight had affected us all and were more than happy to exploit that for the sake of comedy. But of course, this trailer was a fake out because it transitioned into revealing this BHK holding the phone and Neo's first trailer rolled. Shibuya was in 3D. We had a new core cast. Minamimoto was playable, making people that didn't play New Day think that this was a prequel. Hype-chan finally had a name! I think this moment is the single most actually hype thing that this character has done in Neo. And then, it was all over. The sequel anticipation that had been building for nearly a decade was all done. Now began the age of being excited for these two huge new projects. 2 years later, both Neo and the anime are behind us. At least, I think the anime is behind us. They've reran that show so many times, I'm not sure if I actually trust the radio silence. But any news regarding Neo seems to be over, and that is what I get for recording this video weeks in advance. My audio quality sounds slightly different, can you tell? Like I told y'all would happen, and what was surely not a controversial video at all, Neo has come to Steam. And just to be clear, and I will repeat this until the day that I die, Square wasn't on a mission to kill this release by releasing it right before Persona 5. That was just an unfortunate accident. Square also didn't underpromote this release. And finally, yes, Square will likely still see it as a failure because I highly doubt that their expectations have changed. For more info, read the linked Twitter thread that I made : right parenthesis. Square has not shut up about this game for well over a year now. Compare that to a game that actually failed, like Ball and Wonderworld, which Square has quietly avoided mentioning much in recent days. I cannot imagine that Square would be keeping this up for Neo if they didn't have a desire to keep the game alive. Because of that, I am sticking to my guns and saying that we will see The World Ends With You again, and much sooner than it took for Neo to reach us. If today's story has taught us anything, it's that we will probably have to wait for Kingdom Hearts 4 to near completion first. Especially since Akiko Ishibashi, the writer for Neo, is doing writing for Kingdom Hearts 4. Not to mention that Nomura is also, of course, involved with the project. But development seems to be going along well for them, so it's not a huge worry or anything. If I had to make a prediction just so people can come back to this video later and comment how it doesn't age well, Kingdom Hearts 4 will release in 2024 and will feature a World Ends With You tie-in. Soon after, a Neo anime will be announced and do all the financial heavy lifting just like the first anime did, and will soon be followed up by The World Ends With You 3, The Slamurai Slams Back, coming in 2025. That said, it would be nice to have something to tide us over during that time in between, like a good mobile game that can be played internationally. Just spitballing. Ooh, maybe like a mobile rhythm game. Early concepts for the original game were to make it rhythm-based. And there are scrapped rhythm elements left over in Final Remix's files because they didn't have the dev time to clean them up. I'm getting a little derailed, but the point is that I want my mobile rhythm side game. Square, make it happen, please. In the end, we don't really know what the wait for the next game will look like, but we can sure freaking hope that it looks nothing like the wait for the second one. Oh, and special thanks to Bacon King, Kaiser, and Nero Jacob Kurotama for being patrons. Aren't they so cool? Yeah, they're so cool. You know, I'm ending this video in a different style than we normally do since now we have patrons to thank. Usually I just throw up some music and hope you all got off my property, but no. So bizarre.